Hello. If we're ready to begin, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Melanie Metzger. I'm the chair of the Department of Interpretation. Welcome to tonight's fourth presentation of the year of their academic year 2013 and 2014. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. I'd like to welcome all of you who are watching us on the live streaming as well. Our hope was that these lectures throughout the year would show the wonderful work of a number of different individuals who are working on different research studies within the field of interpretation and be able to share that with a very wide audience. Tonight I'm especially thankful to be able to welcome those who are working locally as interpreters and supporting our bachelor students and our master's students as mentors. Welcome to all of you. I'm so happy that you were able to join us tonight. I'd also like to thank several people who helped make this evening possible. The Gallaudet University Regional Interpreting Education Center, GURIEC, has worked with the Department of Interpretation and the National Consortium of Interpreter Education Centers as well, NCIEC, to award funding to support presentations like this. And it comes from the Department of Education RSA Foundation. So thank you, funding. So thank you very much for all of that support. Thank you, Brenda Nicodemus, for all of her tireless work on creating these presentations as well. And I'd just like to thank everyone who made tonight possible and all of us coming together here. So thank you. And I would also like to tell you just a little bit about our next presentation. On March 4th, it'll be in the afternoon from 12:30 to 2 p.m. That's Eastern Time. We will have a presentation given by Erica Alley and Annie Marks, two of our current doctoral students who are studying in our program, and they are researching video relay service interpreting. And they have two different studies that they're going to bring together to share their findings in the presentation in March. Dr. Val Dively will be the respondent for that presentation. She is one of the faculty members from our department. I'd also like to ask everyone to hold the last week of March, the 28th through the 30th, because we will have our very first international research on sign language and translation symposium happening here at Gallaudet University, sponsored by the Department of Interpretation and our National Research Center on Interpretation and Translation Studies. We are coming together to host this international conference, and it will also be live streamed. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to join us for those events as well. It's a very exciting event that we're hosting here. We're looking forward to it. If you would like more information about any of this, please do use a Google search for Gallaudet University International Symposium, and you'll find more information there. And I will now bring us back to tonight's presentation. It is a pleasure. Well, first of all, let me talk about what's going to happen tonight and then introduce our presenter. So we will have a lecture for roughly 40 minutes. At the completion of that presentation, Paul Harrelson, who is another faculty member from the Department of Interpretation, will then come forward and engage in a dialogue with the presenter about her content. At that point, it will then be opened up to the audience to ask any questions that you may have for our presenter as well. And at the conclusion of this event, we have I think it's new, it's a door prize. I hope that you got your tickets. We've never done this before, but we did give out tickets tonight. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a short reception. And I hope that those of you who are here on site can stay for that. I know that our presenter will also be here, and you can purchase her book and have a book signing as well if you would like. So we have a very nice evening planned out today. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sherry Shaw. Dr. Shaw is a professor and program director for the bachelor's and master's degree programs in ASL and English interpretation at the University of Northern Florida. UNF. She's been teaching interpreting for 24 years now, and most recently received the UNF award in 2013 for graduate instruction, and the President's Professorship Award as well. This ties to the international research that she's been doing, looking at interpreting students' cognitive and motivational characteristics and evidence-based admissions testing for interpreting programs, which is a critical area in our field, absolutely. Her research interests include community-based learning through interpreter education, and social connectedness with deaf senior citizens. She also is a co-editor for the Journal of Interpretation. It is my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Sherry Shaw. We are very much looking forward to your presentation on trust and responsibility in the deaf community, community engagement for interpreters and students. Welcome.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet members of the faculty. This is my first time meeting Melanie, and it's been equally enjoyable to meet many other members of the faculty. Thank you so much for extending the invitation to have me come to Gallaudet tonight. This topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart. I hope that you all share the same sentiment about the topic of tonight's talk. 4 years ago, it occurred to me just how strongly I felt about this topic, so strongly that I decided I needed to write on it. I came up with a proposal and submitted it to the Gallaudet University Press. Cynthia Roy, I hope I got her name sign right. Dr. Roy reviewed my proposal and accepted it for publication. I was overjoyed at the time and tonight, and am equally happy to share with you some of the work that I've done, some of what's written in my book, and hopefully by the end of the talk you will also understand why it is so important that the interpreting community and interpreter education programs include service learning components of their curriculum. Sometimes it's referred to as community-based learning, and that's the way I refer to it sometimes, because service learning is not to be confused with community service, which is why I choose to use the term community-based learning oftentimes. I don't feel that interpreters need to be in the business of helping the deaf community, so I want to make sure that that understanding is not derived from the term service learning. When I came on campus, I noticed the banners around campus with Glenn Anderson on them. And I was so struck by his presence, which is quite literally all over campus, because his beliefs tie in so closely to my own beliefs about service learning. So I felt that seeing him, or at least the picture of him, was so appropriate. He was a true mentor of mine, someone that I looked up to. I'll also be talking about trust and responsibility. Each of those words is rather simple. When you talk about the deaf community and interpreters, it seems quite logical that there has to be mutual trust. But what about interpreter education programs? Does the deaf community need to trust those who work in educational programs for interpreters? All three parts of our community have to work together and have to have trust. But what about responsibility? I would argue that it's not optional. It is certainly a duty. You don't have a choice in whether or not you take on certain responsibilities. Those in interpreter programs and working interpreters have a responsibility to the deaf community to ensure that they are working to support their goals. Again, these are the themes I'll be addressing tonight. Trust, culture, alliance. Trust between interpreters, the deaf community, and interpreter education programs. When I talk about culture, I refer to the deaf community as a collective culture, not one that is based on individualist notions. In contrast, the broader hearing community is an individualistic community. And how to build alliances between interpreters, interpreter education programs, and the deaf community are my three most important topics for the night. Secondarily, I'll be talking about boundaries and how our understanding of boundaries and service learning can redefine those understandings of boundaries, yet still maintain professional boundaries. Finally, I'll turn my attention to responsibility. And I will say again that I hope that we all recognize that we may have one understanding of each of these terms currently, but that by the end of the talk, we have a slightly different take on each of those terms. I should tell you a little bit about myself, tell you who I am, a bit about my background, and why I'm even here. I'm sure when you look at me, you think I'm very young. No, not really, right? I've been teaching interpreting for 25 years now. And that's a remarkable amount of time, but it's also comprised remarkable experiences. I'm still learning, and reflecting is so very important even today. My hope in writing my book was to solve some of the issues that I've seen over the past 25 years, particularly those that surround the transition of students to their careers. There's often said to be a gap where students are working in isolation immediately after graduation, and this is still a common topic in our field, that there doesn't seem to be a very strong connection between interpreter education programs and working interpreters. And after 25 years, we still have not answered this need as a field. I think that part of the reason around this issue is trust. As a researcher, I know that my own guesses about reasonings for things are not enough. And my experience is not enough either. You have to collect data to understand problems more clearly and to seek solutions. Another faculty member at University of North Florida, Dr. Jan Humphrey, has also done research on trust, specifically around the perceptions of trust in the deaf community and how they can build trust with interpreters, and the ways in which interpreters can break down trust. This quote is from Dr. Humphrey. I'd like to highlight one very important word in this quote, which is requires. Trust requires the interpreter. Remember that I said that it's not optional. Trust requires the interpreter to be appropriately involved. Now, we may all have different definitions of appropriately and what appropriate involvement would entail, and what sorts of boundaries would be delineated by our beliefs around appropriate involvement. And what do you do when two people who interact have different beliefs around what is an appropriate boundary? This quote, that trust requires the involvement, the interpreter to be appropriately involved in the deaf community, is an idea that I'd like you to keep with you for the remainder of the talk. This image is meant to reflect the fact that trust is not something built in a moment or an instant. I'm sorry to say that building trust takes a great deal of work and sustained effort. It's not something that you build in a single interaction with the deaf community, and that upon the end of that interaction you can be assured that this trust will be maintained. It is maintained via ongoing interaction with the deaf community. Trust is both built from a great deal of work and maintained through a lifetime of work. I can attest to that in the 25 years of my involvement with the deaf community, I know that I always have to make building trust a priority in my life and my career. So this should not be something that you expect to happen overnight, but instead should be something that you commit to and commit a great deal of work to. That said, how does one build trust? First, you have to be present. Do you go to deaf community events? Do deaf people see you? Do they recognize you? Do they know who you are? So that when they see you in an interpreting situation, they'll recognize you. Or will you be someone that shows up on an interpreting assignment post-graduation as a virtual stranger to deaf individuals? If I could share a story about that, I was teaching a course entitled Service Learning in the Deaf Community, which is a course in our program. And at one point in the class, I asked the students what they knew about our local deaf community. Only one student was willing to say that they didn't know anything at all about the deaf community. I was astonished. I clarified, and I said, "Do you really not know anyone or anything about our deaf community?" I should say that this student had been in was a transfer from another program. And he very openly said that he, in fact, did not know anyone in our deaf community and didn't know anything about it. I was dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say or even how to react in front of an entire class. I talked to this student after class and asked if they saw themselves becoming an interpreter. They asserted that they certainly did see themselves being an interpreter, and I asked how they proposed to learn the language. They said that they would study hard and learn it from books. This conversation with this student was a real wake-up call for me. I knew that I absolutely had to change something. I could not have a student graduate with this sort of mentality. I could not have a student graduate from our program as a complete stranger to our local deaf community. And I do learn. My students do teach me something. And this was a shining example of a very hard lesson that I had to learn, but one that I learned from my students. I knew that I had to teach my students that they needed experience in the community, and it was sad that I had a student in my classroom that had not yet engaged with our deaf community. A recent example of one way in which you can engage happened in my community. Last year we had a holiday lunch and a buffet of sorts. The local deaf organization hosted it. It was a very nice reception. A number of community organizations were invited. And in talking with someone, a student of mine caught my eye. I saw this student playing on the ground. So I turned my attention more fully toward this student and saw that they were playing with some of the younger kids who were there with their parents. This student decided that one of the ways in which she would help the parents enjoy their time is that she would essentially babysit their kids. She would just keep an eye on their kids for the night so that their parents could have a good time in a more relaxed manner. So she saw a need and she acted upon it. Parents were really grateful that she took the initiative to do this, And it meant a lot to these parents that this interpreter took interest in their goals of interacting that evening. Now, I don't mean that all interpreters need to look for a need and try to take control of different situations. This brings to mind another quote from Anna Witter-Marathu, and in her work with Johnson, entitled Conversations with Stakeholders. This book showed me that it is possible for interpreting students to over-identify with the deaf community. They may naively simply want to be a part of the deaf community, but the way in which they do it often turns into taking control. This is also not a relationship that can be sustained, as it is one that can often become oppressive. Again, it's often unintentional, but it nevertheless happens that our interpreting students quite unintentionally do in fact oppress the deaf community. I wanted to share these two stories as reflections of things that have happened in my own experience, in my program, but I know that I'm not alone. We're not the only program like that. I thought that by writing a book and sharing these ideas, I might help change minds and spark discussions that would lead us to question our broader society, American society, but also our role within the deaf community and our responsibility to the deaf community. So again, one must build trust, and only with this foundation of trust can you hope to have a long-lasting allied relationship. Now, of course, as I said, trust is built, which means that trust can be destroyed. A far too familiar occurrence in our community is that students who learn ASL enter the deaf community simply to tap into this linguistic resource. Upon gaining enough fluency, these students go off into their professions and are then nowhere to be found in the deaf community. The deaf community sees this pattern, and they've reacted to it. They know that students won't often come back, and they feel taken advantage of. When people come into the community to learn the language and then leave when they've achieved their own purposes, these are things that damage and can destroy trust. Other examples of ways in which trust can be damaged is when you act superior to a deaf person, when you act disengaged and disinterested. I think I've made the argument sufficiently clear as to how one can build trust and how it can be destroyed. Now turning to culture, I've chosen a quote that was written in 1987. This quote was written quite some time ago, but the fact that it's still relevant today shows just how much this is still an issue. This is from Bonnie Sherwood's text in 1987. Some of you in the room hadn't even been born by then. And this topic is still so relevant to our community, and it's one that we're still struggling with. The deaf community does see the lack of trust and the lack of a desire to build trust as problematic. In the late 70s and early 80s, when interpreter education programs were in their infancy, they were just being founded with funding from the Department of Education. Brought to mind, how had interpreters been prepared prior to interpreter education programs? what happened was that the deaf community grew their own interpreters. Some interpreters were children whose parents were deaf. The deaf community functioned as gatekeepers. It was the deaf community who decided who would be able to work as an interpreter or not. When interpreter education programs were formalized, this gatekeeping role was taken away from the deaf community, and interpreter education programs now exist largely apart from the deaf community. We're now at a place where we're trying to figure out how to bring interpreter education programs and the deaf community back together again, and how to restore the place of the deaf community to the heart of interpreter education programs. We know now in hindsight that this separation was a mistake. It was an unintentional one, but it's one that we engaged in with an eye towards progress in having formalized interpreter education programs. But we did this without thinking about the consequences of not having the deaf community be an integral part of interpreter education programs. Another point I'd like to make around culture has to do with mindset. I think I'm safe in saying that all interpreter education students have to take a class on culture. And very often, when you get a text on culture, you find that there are definitions of deaf culture. Usually students take the class, they pass it, and they move on. It's simply a course in the curriculum. But when do students live in the deaf community? When and where do they develop a sense of deaf heart? In a class about deaf culture? Highly unlikely. If you truly recognize that a culture is something lived by a group of people, then you have to place the people as priority. And that's true for a collective culture, certainly. The broader American culture, though, is highly individualistic, the most important principles being independence and autonomy. And many of us know from reading these textbooks that in this way, the deaf community, which is collective, is very different from the broader American culture. This brings to mind a situation from the 2008 Olympics regarding two little girls that performed at the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games. Of course, as a part of the opening ceremonies, there was a great deal of performance that included parades, marching, singing, dancing. It was a real celebration of national pride. And one performance in particular was a rendition of a song in Chinese that was sung by a 7-year-old Chinese girl. She took the stage and sang an absolutely astonishingly beautiful rendition of this traditional song. All eyes were on this little girl, this 7-year-old girl. People were so moved by the beauty of her performance and also just how cute she was. With her captivating smile, people were taken with her and were then dismayed to find out that in fact she was not the one singing. There was another little girl behind stage whose voice was actually being broadcast. The cute little girl who had taken the stage was simply lip-syncing. When news of this traveled to the U.S., we were outraged. We were so concerned about the self-esteem of the little girl whose voice was being broadcast. We thought for sure her self-esteem was damaged beyond repair. The response, however, from Chinese officials was that having a beautiful young girl be on the stage, the center of the world's attention, was in the national interest of China. This is a view of a collectivist culture, but the American view was that something was wrong with that decision. These two views were in such radical opposition. Now, knowing that story, you can understand that cultures are different in a very cognitive way. But how does one live in a culture that is so radically different? You can't do it in a classroom. No matter how much you read, no matter how much you study. To truly develop a humanistic understanding of someone else's lived experience and their lived reality, to understand their lives, you have to be with people. You can't get that from a classroom. Simple as that. This is why we need to make service learning a key component of our curricula. That is part of the answer. So, I talked a little bit about the history of interpreter preparation and that it used to lie within the deaf community. Over time, it evolved to a very formalized structure apart from the deaf community. Related to that idea, I wanted to show you an excerpt from a chapter in Service Learning and Interpreting Education. This one chapter changed my life. The chapter was written by Christine Monikowski and Rico Peterson. They talked about how service learning can change the structure as we know it and can restore the place of the deaf community to a key component of our interpreter education programs. And it's no exaggeration to say that it changed my life. It changed who I am as an interpreter, who I am as an educator, and who I am as a program administrator. In every aspect of my career, in every role that I take on, this chapter, this one chapter, had such a profound impact that it shifted my thinking in a way that shifted my action. I always feel like I can do more, but I also recognize that we have to start somewhere. I'm very fortunate to be working at the University of North Florida, which has a Bachelor's of Science program. It began in 2007, which is only 2 years after the chapter in this book was written. So I had already read the book at this time. I was at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. I had been there for 18 years, working in an interpreter education program. I moved to Florida in 2007. And I should say that when I lived in Arkansas, I knew that my interactions with the deaf community were very rich. Little Rock is the heart of civil rights movement, and the community in that area remains very active, especially our Black deaf community. So this is a characteristic of the Little Rock community. National Black Deaf Advocates was actually formed in Little Rock by Dr. Glenn Anderson, one of our first community leaders, and if I'm not mistaken, actually founded NBDA. Glenn went around the region to train other trainers, to teach other Black deaf people to become advocates. This is an important characteristic of the Little Rock community, that we are home to the National Black Deaf Advocates. We also have a very active deaf-blind community. Part of the reasoning for this has to do with our geographic location. We're near Louisiana, and there's a company that is incorporated in Louisiana that is founded by deaf-blind people. We also have a very active senior citizen community. So Little Rock is a very big little city, or maybe a little big city. It is certainly a major city in its geographic area. It also is home to the School for the Deaf that serves students in a wide area. So I took that level of activism, I took these characteristics of deaf communities for granted. I thought all deaf communities were like that, until I moved to Jacksonville. I knew that Jacksonville was a major city. It was a very big city, 842 square miles, so quite literally a very big city. You can drive for what feels like hours and hours and still be in the city limits of Jacksonville, so it is certainly a big city. Florida has several major cities going down the coast from Jacksonville all the way down to Miami, across to Tampa, over to Orlando, and up to Tallahassee. The School for the Deaf is in St. Augustine, which is not too far south from Jacksonville. It's about an hour south of our school, so fairly close. There were several demographic differences I found, though, between Florida and Little Rock. I had to really undertake a study of the deaf community and learn about my community, my new community, which was very different from my Little Rock community. Monikowski and Peterson really gave me pause. Their work gave me a chance to sit back, reflect, and to realize that I had to study my community and to think about where I was in that very moment. Again, I need to start by saying that when I talk about service learning, I'm not referring to helping anyone. If you see anyone refer to this concept in a way in ASL that has a connotation of helping, then I would argue that that's an incorrect understanding of service learning. A more accurate connotation would be one that has to do with supporting and fostering learning. Our program has worked hard to make sure that our goals are very purposefully aligned with the goals of our deaf community. Dr. Eileen Forrestal wrote the foreword in my recently published book. She's a member of the faculty who is deaf and is an outspoken proponent for developing fluency in ASL, for developing an awareness of the deaf community and understanding the deaf community's lived experience through service learning. I'll show you a clip of her talking about her beliefs around why service learning is so important. I'd like to talk for a moment about Dr. Shaw's webinar about service learning. and to share my perspective as a deaf person, as a person who has been involved in interpreter education programs as well. I see very clearly just how tantamount it is that interpreting students build true and lasting relationships with the deaf community through true actions. We all know that actions speak louder than words. Actions like engaging with the deaf community, taking part in activities put on by the deaf community, have the ability to change the perspective of interpreters and interpreting students. They can truly see the world through deaf people's eyes, to understand their goals, desires, their need for advocacy, and their ambitions. The deaf community has given so much to interpreters. We've given our language, we've given our culture, and quite unfortunately, we haven't seen much in return. Service learning, however, provides an opportunity for students to develop an understanding of the need for alliances and to develop a sense of deaf heart, to develop a level of understanding that goes beyond the textbook, that truly reaches the heart and the mind. And that type of understanding, that type of deaf heart understanding is so important, not only for interpreters, but for anyone that is working between two cultures. Interpreters in the deaf community, of course, working between English and ASL, hearing cultures and perspectives, and deaf cultures and perspectives. How can you seek to work between these two communities without fully understanding yourself and your relationship to each of these communities? For these reasons, I think it is so important for students to take part in service learning in a way that reinforces the actions of the deaf community to support their goals and to help them work towards their aims. It's not up for the students to decide what the deaf community needs or what a deaf individual might need. Conversely, it is the deaf community who can lay out very clearly what their goals are, and they can extend the opportunity for the student to work with them. This is how you can build an alliance.
I love the sign that she uses in that video. The sign that she uses, I'm sure that you've heard quite a bit of dialogue happening around the concept of deaf heart, and that interpreters need to develop deaf heart. And that's the sign that Eileen uses for the concept of deaf heart. And her concept here that she's talking about is that service learning can actually allow an interpreter to build deaf heart. We need to know, and we need to do. We need to have the competency, the knowledge, the skills. And we can show that we have that through our actions. So we need to know how to interpret, but that's not the only skill we have to have. We have to be able to really do it. And so I think she has a very powerful statement here that she shared with us. This graphic shows what service learning can actually look like. This is just one example. I, of course, teach service learning courses, and I was fortunate to establish a new program, which means that I am in charge of the program. I can develop the courses, the classwork, what students take and in what order they take it. And so I actually have implemented 2 different sections of service learning that students take. Now, in my book, I do emphasize that service learning has to be it does not have to be an additional outside activity. It needs to be central to the curriculum, just the same as any other interpreting course that a student takes. Service learning needs to be emphasized during our programs and throughout them. So this example actually happened in Little Rock quite a few years ago. At that time, there were, I'd say, many older deaf members of the community who were living alone or living a little bit isolated, couldn't really drive as much anymore for various reasons. And someone told me in the interpreting program about that there were deaf people who really needed just someone to come and visit, someone to talk with, to engage with, because they were lonely, of course, alone all day in their house, unable to go anywhere. So they actually asked if my students would possibly be able to go out and meet these older deaf citizens and engage with them. So I thought, absolutely, that seemed like a really great idea. So we organized it all, got it all prepared, and what ended up happening, there were actually two very special things that came out of that. So every week, the students would go to a deaf person's house. I would go and bring a student with me, and other faculty members would do that as well. There were 3 of us involved. Sometimes we'd actually bring a whole group of students with us over to the person's house. And of course, they were very excited to have us there. They opened their door, saw who was there. Everyone was dressed so nicely, of course, ready to make a really good impression because they were excited too. And it seemed like a really simple thing. We were meeting with people who were in their 90s. And there was a couple specifically that we went to meet who was in their 90s. And they were really looking forward to these Tuesday gatherings with our students. So we would play games with them. We would do whatever it was that they wanted to do, play cards. And this couple actually gave us permission to film some of these interactions because the language that they used was phenomenal. And I myself just really love older people. I love the language of older deaf citizens. And we know as those people pass away, we lose their language. And that's critical that we capture it and that we are able to maintain it and share it with future generations. So we did film the 2 of them. We asked. They said that would be fine. And so they gave us our permission. We, of course, went through all of the paperwork, had them sign their permission forms, etc., and allowed us to film. It's really funny because they met actually at the World Fair in somewhere in the 1930s. 2 of them, that's where they met. And so they told us this whole story about their lives, about their marriage. Just, told us all of the details of their life. And the woman was sitting in a chair signing away, and her husband was sitting behind her, and she actually couldn't see him. And so he started signing at the same time. And she looked over at him and said, "You've got to stop talking. It's my turn to tell a story." And so they just argued and argued. It was just the cutest little encounter. So it was an amazing time that we were allowed to spend with that couple. And just 1 week later, the husband passed away. Just 1 week after we filmed that interaction, the husband passed away. And so we made copies of this, and we shared the copy with the family. Because, of course, this is a very memorable and important item now for that family. And if you remember, I told you Glenn was involved. He was a mentor in Little Rock. And in Little Rock, there are older graduates of the deaf school that are in the community that often function as mentors within the deaf community. And so this woman, the woman in this couple, was also a graduate of the School for the Deaf. And she was now deafblind. She was deaf her whole life but lost her vision later. And so we brought our students to meet with her every single week. And if you can imagine, I'm the teacher, the director of a program, etc., but still, I'm making this time and investing this time in the deaf community because that's what's most important, and that's the important component of service learning. It absolutely takes time. Yes, it does. But what's more important? Just working in my office all day long, developing curriculum and whatever else and ignoring the deaf community? That is an example of apathy right there. That is apathy. So Glenn and I worked together on filming this woman, and Glenn filmed a number of people around the area as well, other graduates from the segregated school at that time. Of course, the black deaf students went to a segregated school from the white deaf students, so he filmed a lot of different members of the community, and I was focusing on deaf senior citizens. And so we worked together. And I started talking about the word trust. And it's this type of activity that really allows trust to be built between Glenn, with the deaf community, with older deaf citizens, with their families. So many people benefit from service learning activities such as this. And so this was my very first service learning project, and I learned so much from it then, and I've learned so much ever since. And so I just wanted to share one example of what service learning can look like. Now you may be wondering what the learning piece of service learning is, or how is it that students learn? Because it's not a prepared lesson. You don't have specific points or content. But the learning takes place, whether it's language or culture or developing the sense of deaf heart, that learning happens. It's incidental, so it's not planned, but it does happen. It does occur. Now, alliance doesn't necessarily mean advocate. It doesn't mean crusader. What you must do is first find out what a community's goals are and then support those goals. You don't enter a community and find out what the goals are and then take over them yourself and try to accomplish them. That's not how you build an alliance. That's not how you build trust. You can't speak for the deaf community. You must work as an ally to support the deaf community in achieving their goals. So, what do you do to instill service learning? You can't just hop out of the box and get going right away. You have to step back and actually look at what your local community is comprised of. What are the strengths of the local community? It's really easy to look at the deaf community and think, here's a problem. Oh, here's another problem. Oh, here's a need. And become very focused on needs. But that's not where the focus should be for this. The focus should be on the strengths. What does that community have? There are many strengths in every community, and that's where the focus for service learning needs to lie. So we have our students, we talk and try and figure out who the leaders are, what activities are happening, what's going on in the community, what are those strengths. It can be about the deaf community, but it can also be about the interpreter, the student themselves. What are their own individual strengths? What is the strengths of the college? And where can a partnership be formed between the strengths of the deaf community, the interpreting student, and the program? Because all of those entities have strengths. They all have something to contribute. So the goal is to find out where those intersections lie. So you can see here the intersection where all three areas cross is where alliance can be built. Each one is contributing equally to building alliance and trust. I think I've talked about this quite a bit. But you have to identify a goal. You have to identify what the goals of the community are and then align yourself with them. I'll give you an example. Our Jacksonville Senior Citizen, or our Jacksonville Deaf Club had a a group that decided that they wanted to learn more about certified deaf interpreters, that they'd heard about the concept of CDIs often but didn't understand what it really meant, and they wanted to know more. So we at the college then provided some training about CDIs because we were in support of the goal of that deaf club. So that was a very simple one. That community was also experiencing a shift, sort of a rift between the older deaf community and the younger deaf community. The older deaf community felt that younger deaf people no longer needed them, that deaf children were mainstreamed, that they were mainstreamed in schools by themselves. They didn't have a sense of deaf culture. They didn't have a sense of generational storytelling that exists within the deaf community. They were lacking that. And so the older members of the deaf community were very concerned about that lack of awareness and involvement and wanted to engage those deaf students who were mainstreamed and didn't have access, to bring together the young and old deaf members of the community. So they told us that that was a goal, that they were very concerned about it, and asked what we could do. And so we actually established a storytelling group. And we had older members of the deaf community that would go out to various schools and tell stories through ASL. And the class might only have just one deaf child in it. And this deaf member would go and tell a story to help instill a sense of identity, a sense of language and culture within that one deaf child. The other children in the room may not know ASL, so they would need an interpreter for this. But then the deaf child didn't need the interpreter, so it was a reverse of the norm for them. And so then that can help them to build that sense within themselves. And we can help to teach deaf children and the hearing children around them to see a new respect for the deaf child in the classroom. And that, again, promoted the goals of the deaf community. So those were a couple more examples of service learning opportunities we've had in Jacksonville. So I've talked about two of these examples. The second one on the list is about teens and learning self-advocacy for communication. The deaf community again identified and discussed that they really needed to help out their young people, the deaf youth, the deaf teens, learn to be advocates for themselves about communication and about their rights. And so we at the interpreting program provided a location at the university. We paid for a bus to bring the young people to our campus. And we provided, there was an all-day training then provided, taught by deaf people. So these young deaf teens could look up to an adult role model, an adult deaf role model. Another example, within our graduate program, we had two students who were living in Orlando. And for our graduate students, they are responsible to do asset mapping, to identify the strengths of their communities, to identify what their community has. And so in Orlando, they have NASA. Of course, that's right there where NASA is, and there are a number of deaf people who work there. So our graduate students talked with those employees about what they wanted. You know, the idea of maybe having deaf high school students who are mainstreamed come to NASA to see the deaf employees working in NASA on rocket science and other topics. Of course, it's not like UNF has an endless amount of money in their budget. We have to be conservative about where we spend our funds, but it only cost, but to get 50 deaf students, we would have to pay for buses, we would have to figure out how to get 50 deaf students to NASA. So our students actually did the fundraising. Companies donated the money to support this. So our students did the fundraising, paid for the buses, and again had 50 students come on over to NASA and take a tour. They were able to see all of NASA, get very excited about it. But what was most important there was to see the deaf employees. They had a panel of the deaf employees talking about what their jobs were. And these young deaf people were able to say, I could do that too. To feel a connection to that role model. And some of those had never met another deaf person in their entire lives. Some of those children. They had been raised by themselves with just an interpreter in their classroom and never met another deaf person. So that was an incredibly powerful, profound, and life-changing experience for them. And the deaf employees felt proud of their work as well. So it became a win-win situation for everyone around, and we were just allowed to watch it happen. That's all we needed to do. We just needed to watch it happen. It was amazing. So do you think that all interpreters happily embrace the idea of service learning? They actually don't. There's a fair amount of resistance. And you wonder why, because I've been talking about all the reasons that service learning is a thing to do and why it's, I've been praising it along the way and given some good examples, but there is some resistance out there. People say that service learning is not professional. And that having an interpreter education program partner with the deaf community is not professional. Now, I sometimes have to, I try not to judge, I do, but I still sometimes can't stop from thinking, how is it possible for you to think about that in that way? How can you so fundamentally disagree with service learning? And what I've been told is people have quoted the CPC, the Code of Ethics, and said that it's a very strict set of rules that we have to follow, our Code of Professional Conduct. Which is the ethical guidance for interpreters, and they quote that to me. And so I've asked to those people, do you feel that this is not in line with the CPC? And so I actually did my own research. I went to the RID website, pulled up the CPC myself, and looked at it, and I just can't see it. I can't see the disagreement. Maybe I'm blind to it, I'm not sure, but I don't see anywhere in there that service learning would be in conflict with our CPC. I just don't see it. But there is some resistance out there. Now, within my book, I've included some stories about student experiences, and some of those who felt very resistant about service learning, because they felt that it sounded like community service or helping or doing a car wash to fundraise or something like that. They had a very limited idea of what it meant to engage in service learning, and so began their journey very resistant. And in my book, I talk quite a bit more about that from the student perspective, and where they were able to broaden their expectations and understanding of what it meant to form an alliance with the deaf community through service learning. Now, I hope you came here planning to stay all night with me, right? Everybody's planning to be here all night long. I'm a very fun person. We're having a good time so far. If you're falling asleep, I apologize. I have gone on a little bit long, but I do have a timekeeper there keeping an eye on me, I think, right? Let's talk about the word boundary. Now, there's a theory here about boundaries saying that you have a start and an end to your boundary. It's very rigid. That a boundary is inflexible and immovable. It's better for me to kind of show it this way, in the idea that there are certain things that you will not do, and there are certain things that can be done, and that they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. It's a black and white, a yes and no, and that's it. And some people think that way about boundaries. Just recently, one researcher by the name of Naja Grbić from Austria was researching boundaries and boundaries with interpreters and how boundaries can be flexible, how they absolutely can be flexible, not rigid. It's important within our profession that we don't allow boundaries to become an us versus them mentality. That's not the right way to look at boundaries. I think this image shows it a little bit better. There's actually an ocean near my house, of course, and if you draw a line in the sand, just wait a little bit. 10 minutes later, it's washed away by the waves, or it's moved a little bit, or it's gray, fuzzy, dissolved a little bit. So the boundary has moved, it has changed. And you can move those boundaries around. You can draw a new line in the sand in a different location. And you can still be professional while doing that. This research is fascinating for me. It's called boundary work. And what it means is that each of us has to find within ourselves what is right for us. So each interpreting program also has to do that as well. What is right for the program? So you need to determine, do you have rigid boundaries or do you have flexibility within your boundaries? And I would encourage, as you leave today, that you continue to study boundary work. I think my time tonight is limited, but I really would encourage that if you are interested in learning more about this, that you do some investigations of boundary work yourselves. I think outside of this room we have a list of references that you can pick up on your way out. All of my references for my presentation today. So I hope that you'll grab one of those and get a bunch of ideas from that list of what you can look at and what you can do. Because I do have it ready for you as you leave tonight if you would like to pick one up. So what are the outcomes of service learning? Trust is built or reestablished. Alliances are strengthened. Boundaries are changed. And also our future practitioners have a sense of this responsibility, of their own personal responsibility. I want to share a story with you from one of our deaf faculty members at UNF. He actually used to be a science teacher at the School for the Deaf. And so, of course, he knows quite a bit about science. And he came to UNF and he's now teaching ASL. The story that he shares here, I think, is a profound one. I think you'll find it very moving to watch. Again, I'm Michael Stoltz, and I teach ASL at the University of North Florida, UNF. Very proud. The topic I want to talk about is trust in the community. Trust between interpreters and deaf people. And the alliances and overlap that can be seen there. I've given a lot of thought to this. And so I want to share with you. I'm, of course, from a very small town, St. Augustine, which is where the School for the Deaf is. I have 2 children who are hearing. And I was involved, of course, in their activities, their sports, young life, etc. The different activities that children do. And, of course, they had their friends whose parents were involved as well. We went to the YMCA, the rec center, and many other parents were involved with their children. Now, some of them were volunteer coaches, and I noticed that they came from professional families and backgrounds. They were physicians and attorneys, police officers or firemen. And they all came together and interacted. We had a number of CEOs, business owners, people who were very reputable in the community and very well known. And that, to me, was what made me think of interpreting and the interpreting profession. Because we have the deaf community, but interpreters often feel that they cannot be involved in the deaf community. The deaf community interacts with each other, and interpreters stand to the side. And I see a real conflict with that. We have so many different people in the deaf community from so many different professions and walks of life that all are there and getting along and interacting with each other. And when it's time to work, of course it's time to work and to be professional, but outside of that, you can be personal and you can interact. And interpreters have drawn this line and are unwilling to engage in that. And so when an interpreter enters that mix of the deaf community, I kind of get a sense of who they are. I can see their language, I can talk with them, I can develop trust with them. So when it's time for them to then actually work for me, to be an interpreter and work together, I know who they are. And this isn't about learning someone's personal business, because I know what their character is. I know if they're the type that will respect privacy, and I know who it is that I'm now working with. And if I don't have that opportunity to engage, I don't know who they are, I haven't developed that sense of character about them, then I don't have the trust for them. The trust isn't there. And so when interpreters set that boundary and set themselves so apart from the community, it doesn't allow for that trust to be built. It doesn't allow for me to understand who they are. And so I saw that parallel to the different communities and felt that, in my opinion, interpreters should engage. Now, Michael is also a graduate of Gallaudet University, and he's very proud of Gallaudet. So, re-enfranchising. Interpreter education programs need to bring the deaf community back into the center and build their programs around the deaf community, not disenfranchised from the deaf community. I believe my time is out. I will now turn the floor over to Paul, who's going to summarize and engage in a discussion. Thank you all so much for your attention this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I'd like to start by congratulating you not only on the talk, but on your recent publication, your work. A number of researchers, members of the deaf community, interpreters, interpreter educators, have recognized your work and echo the same sentiment of missing the good old days. Many interpreters in the room today found their entree to the interpreting profession by way of the deaf community. And it was the deaf community that then let these people know when they were ready to become interpreters. And this way of gatekeeping, the good old days, are all but gone. I think efforts from like-minded individuals, such as yourself, are setting a trend for making sure to fill that void created by the separation between the deaf community and interpreting community. I'd like to respond first to your talk by asking about what you see as the role for deaf students that are in interpreter education programs, specifically around service learning. I imagine that your goal for deaf students aiming to become interpreters would be different from goals that you might have for hearing students seeking to become interpreters. Might they learn more about microcultures within the deaf community, cultures that they are not a part of. So if there is a student who is not African American, might they take part in activities sponsored by the African American deaf community? If they are young, should they interact with senior citizens? In what ways can they build alliances or seek to build bridges between the deaf community and hearing students or organizations? Could you speak to that a bit?
Yes, that's absolutely a wonderful question. We do have deaf students within our program. And at the beginning, I was a little thrown off. I wasn't quite sure what to do with our deaf students. Because, of course, they were already members of the deaf community. They already had deaf heart. It was already instilled within them. And so, the same as you, you just mentioned micro communities and micro cultures. That's what we thought of. Because they actually might not know the strengths of their own communities, and how much they didn't know that surprised me. We sometimes assume that deaf people know everything about the deaf community as a default of being deaf. But to actually get out there, to engage, to talk, and to learn about the strengths of the community was somewhat of a new thing with that specific goal for our deaf students. They had never thought about seeking out those specific deaf leaders and identifying who they were. It might have been their own community, but they still didn't know that they could enter it with this specific goal. And I don't mean goals in the way of saying that you have to accomplish task 1, 2, and 3 as a goal, but it's also not just, I feel like I would like to do something. You need to have everyone engaged in finding something. So the deaf students were able to find out something about their community and find out where they fit within that. And it's actually our deaf students who have become the strongest proponents of the service learning component of our program. And for me, that's been inspiring to see. There was one semester we had a deaf student who was very involved in the deaf community and decided themselves to then teach service learning at a college in their own area after they'd been involved in our program. So there was a sense of bringing this to others immediately, just upon having experienced it themselves first. So it was difficult at first, but part of learning means that students have to be willing to do self-reflection, to think about themselves, to keep journals, and to always be thinking about who they are and what they're doing. And sometimes deaf students hadn't done that ever before. They hadn't really looked at who they were and what they wanted in terms of their future career as a certified deaf interpreter. And so it really turned out to be very well done and beneficial for them as well.
If you could have a magic wand and create a research agenda, there's a number of PhD students in the room and a number watching online as well. So if you could create a research agenda having to do with this topic for students to work on proving that service learning works, what would be your first step in creating that research agenda?
So he mentioned research, and my eyes got real bright and shiny. I'm very excited. I love research, and my students know that about me. They say Dr. Shaw and research, it's her thing, but absolutely it is. Now, service learning is, of course, tied to people. It's very difficult to collect information or data because it has to be done in a one-on-one manner. You can't do a survey. You have to reach out to each individual to gain what their story is. So one topic that I really need some research done on is the idea of sustainability. So if we establish a program, or if we establish some sort of activity or action in alliance with the deaf community, is it sustainable? Or once the class is finished, does it no longer function? Does it dissolve? Because if you're taking class for just one semester, what happens once you're not in that class anymore? And so I really want to do some research to see how many of these service learning projects or activities that have been implemented are continuing. For example, I talked about the NASA experience in Orlando. I really want to follow up with them, to follow up with the those projects that are out there that have taken place and to see where they've gone. I know there's one project that was established at the School for the Deaf, which was a Girl Scout program. They didn't have one, and the mothers wanted to do a Girl Scout troop for their children. So we worked with them to establish that, and that is still running. It is still up and functional. But I would really like to research that, to see what happens. Are we just jumping in for a semester and jumping back out? And then is the trust then dissolved or damaged because we aren't there ongoing, because it isn't sustainable? So that, I think, is one. Sustainability. Did we establish a program that can continue to run even once we're done with our class? Secondly, I would say deaf perspectives. Deaf perspectives contain so much information for us, and it's very slow to collect that kind of data. But I do still feel very strongly that we need to collect that data. We need to base our programs on data. We need evidence-based research guiding what we're doing, not just what we think we should be doing. And so the need for that evidence means we actually have to go out there and collect the data, whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative, or whether it's mixed methods, whatever it may be, we need to do it. And so I'm hoping that we can find some time to do some more in-depth research related to service learning.
Well, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our time. I have plenty more questions lined up for you. I'm sure that other students and other people in the audience will have plenty of questions during the reception. We unfortunately don't have time to allow for any questions at this time. Thank you, Dr. Shaw.
Yes, and please email me. My address is up here. You can contact me at any time. I am happy to talk via email or video phone or any way that we can.
With that, I would like to thank you so very much for all of you who have participated via the live streaming. For those of you who are here in person, please do stay for refreshments and again to see who won that door prize. As a reminder, we do have extra time at the end of the talk during which Dr. Shaw will be available for book signings and further discussion. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all very much.